Violence and oppression against Black people are ever present both in North America and around the world. Yet, non-Black people often only pay attention to this cruelty temporarily, usually in the wake of noteworthy injustices. Most recently, this includes the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Tony McDade, Elijah McClain, Regis Corshinsey Paquette, Dominique Fells, Alawatoin Salo, the ongoing protests they sparked, and the police brutality inflicted on those who demand justice. We're talking today about how to move forward from this particularly poignant period of police violence and make the fight for justice a permanent feature in the North American mindset.
We've been using the word systemic, so I want to ask another question, and that is, part of the challenges dealing with racism that's deeply embedded in our systems. Someone mentioned the school system, we've mentioned criminal justice systems, etc. So if systems are a major part of this problem and moving away from this idea of sort of person-to-person racism, the bigoted person on the street, have we reached a point where we still have hope in transforming or reforming systems, or are we having to now consider more radical or more fundamental movements for change? Wondering, Anthony, if you could pick up this one around, working to reform systems versus saying we've got to dismantle systems from the bottom up and try something entirely new.
Sure. I think both can happen at the same time. In engaging in these conversations, I like to think a lot about our histories, the histories of our Black people of African descent. And when you think particularly about the ways in which slave revolts work, you have folks who will function on the daily on the plantation, knowing that there's a plan in place, that there's going to be a day and time when they're actually going to turn things over and free themselves, the folks who are enslaved on the plantation. So that planning, that organizing, that process towards thinking about the elimination of this system is actually happening at the same time where enslaved people were carrying out their duties until the right time came, where the plan came together. I'm thinking particularly about the Haitian Revolution. Haiti is a big country. For the enslavement of people of African descent to be overturned in that space was quite phenomenal in the way in which it happened. While the brutalities of the slave plantation were ongoing, there was active planning and organizing and eventually a toppling of that system. And so I do believe that radical reform is required. At the same time, I think there's still shifts and changes that need to happen within mainstream systems until there's a coalescence of both of those forces, and then we move into change and a process of almost creative destruction towards creating a new world of freedom, a brighter world of freedom, not just for Black people, but for all people.
Is there still value in thinking about changing police forces to be less anti-Black, to approach policing in a way that doesn't result in Black death? Is there still a hope for that? Or should we be turning our attention to recent calls for first defunding of police and then second moving toward abolishing police? And then I want to get into a question around, do we need police? But that's another question.
I absolutely support defunding the police because the police forces across this country receive a surplus amount of money that they don't need, essentially. So American police departments all across this country have a budget of at least $115 billion. In New York City, the NYPD is the largest police force in this nation. They have a budget of $6 billion every single year. What do they do with that? Absolutely nothing but terrorize Black and brown communities across the state. So what defunding the police looks like to me is extracting that unnecessary amount of money and resources that these police departments receive and putting them back into the communities that need it the most, putting it back into programs that would help catapult communities, especially disenfranchised communities, under resourced communities, and underfunded communities, and really help radically change the system in which we live in which these impoverished communities live in. So putting money into educational systems, putting money into job programs, putting money into food programs to eliminate food deserts all across this country. Like there's so many better ways that these resources and money can be allocated instead of giving this surplus amount of money to police departments that do absolutely nothing with the money but terrorize Black people. That's literally what it is in this country. So that's why people are tired in this country. That's why people are calling to defund police departments all across this country. And that does not mean leave them with $0 and nothing to function with, but it's simply saying that they don't need that much money. And in terms of abolishment of the police, that is an uphill battle. And right now, within this movement, specifically my organization, Black Lives Matter Greater New York, we are operating very strategically. Now, to answer your question that we're going to get into later, I don't believe we need the police. I wouldn't say need. They're a part of our society, but I wouldn't say we need the police. They're just here. What we need is resources. What we need is sustainable wages and jobs. What we need is education, not just regular education, but radical transformative education that would really propel young Black people across this country to be the leaders that we are aspiring to be, not holding us down. That's what we need right now. I don't believe we need police. They're just here and they're doing a whole lot of damage.
I think it's really important to just look at the outcomes, the disproportionate rates at which Black, Indigenous, and Brown people are killed, violated, harmed, disappeared by police services, or just have their lives left in tatters. If you just look at the record of police services alone, it doesn't bode well for any argument that they're needed. The only way in which I think would be fair or reasonable to say that they're needed is to say that they're not needed more than social workers, healthcare workers, arts programmers, architects, doctors. There's so many institutions and services that we need for the function of our society, way more. So even if we want to give any credibility to the argument that it's needed, it's definitely not needed more than those critical services. I didn't mention teachers as one of those, and transformative teachers as was articulated already. And so we really need to recognize that this system of policing is particularly in Canada, especially in Canada, comes out of a very particular history, out of a desire to control, manage, and contain Indigenous populations. That's what it was for. The Northwest Mounted Police, which ended up becoming the current RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they were directly a colonial force meant to contain, control, and if necessary, and it happened too many, in their idea, what was necessary, killing Indigenous people. And Canada specifically adopted its first formal police service. I think this is an interesting note. The very same year that the enslavement of Black people in Canada was abolished. And while a lot of our records are still being pulled together to see if there's a direct connection, I would make the argument that you can infer that part of policing emerging as a formalized service on the very same year that enslaved people were made free. I think there's a connection there.
When it comes to first defunding the police, let's really think through why it is that police budgets have skyrocketed, particularly in the last few decades. And part of the reason why police budgets have skyrocketed has been because Americans and local elected officials have been led to believe, or actually have been made others believe, that the way in which you fight crime, particularly violent crime, is with more police, is with more jails. And that's how you curb violent crime. But there's no evidence that shows that if you put more police or more jails, that it's going to curb violent crime. But what if all along, instead of funding more police, more military armor for police, more jails, we were funding more jobs? To give an example, study after study shows this relationship between a community with higher levels of poverty, higher levels of unemployment, long-term unemployment, typically have higher levels of violent crime. So we know that, but instead of putting money to reduce unemployment levels or poverty levels, which is the root of the problem in many places, in which people literally engage in crimes out of desperation, out of poverty, instead provide more funding for the police. So to me, it makes, even if you're serious about quelling crime, let alone, police violence, let alone mass incarceration, it makes more sense to transfer funding, to areas that can really uplift the situation of any given community. And then I think when it comes to abolish the police, again, I think it's critically important for people to really understand the context of how and why people would call for the abolition of police, particularly after the series of deaths, whether Breonna Taylor or even sort of George Floyd. I know, as a Black person who was born and raised in a Black community in Jamaica, Queens, New York, I have never really been able to separate police from violence or police from brutality. And one of the things that I've been encouraging people to think about is, for many Americans, they are able to separate police from brutality. So, in other words, when they hear abolish the police, they literally hear abolish the police. But for other people who can't separate police from brutality, what they're ultimately saying is abolish the brutality. Now, others are like, oh, we can stop the brutality by reforming the police. And other Americans are like, that's impossible. When have the police not been brutal? And I think that's really the sort of crux of the debate. And I think oftentimes it's easy, if you have not been subjected to the brutality, for you to say, oh yeah, we can just reform away the brutality. But if you're the subject of that brutality, then that's going to fall on deaf ears. And again, people are going to continue to call for the abolition of police in the way people were calling for the abolition of slavery. There was no reforming slavery. Slavery was by its very nature brutal. And so there was no way to, quote, make it better. And I think people should understand that about the police. And again, it's not, those who are calling for the abolition of police are not saying that if there's a problem, that nobody should arrive. But they want a complete reorientation and complete conception of public safety.